I remember her voice, soft, hurried, almost embarrassed by what it was about to say. "You'll be fine in economy, Mom." That's what my daughter told me at the airport that morning. Her words brushed with that new kind of politeness people use when they're already halfway out of care. She said it like it was a favor, like she was offering me freedom instead of distance. I stood there holding my small oxygen tank in one hand and my boarding pass in the other, watching her slide her card across the counter to upgrade herself to business class. She didn't even look back to see if I'd heard. I heard every word, every syllable, every rustle of the silk scarf she adjusted around her neck, as if the world had grown too cold for her, but not for me. I'm 81 years old. I walk with a cane that belonged to my husband, and I travel with that little silver tank that hums quietly beside me when the air gets too thin. I don't like to think of myself as fragile, but I suppose fragility has its own way of announcing itself, like the hiss of oxygen or the tremor in a hand that once wrote letters too neatly to be ignored. The airport was busy that morning, bodies moving with the restless rhythm of people trying to escape their own lives for a few days. My daughter, Claire, thrives in places like that. Bright lights, endless choices, the comfort of transaction. She's 54, a marketing executive, always rushing somewhere important. She loves airports because they make her feel in motion, above the world, immune to stillness. I used to be that way once. When her father was alive, we would fly everywhere, Denver, Montreal, sometimes even Europe when the savings allowed. I loved the feeling of takeoff, that moment when the ground gave up its claim on you. It used to make me feel alive. Now it only makes me feel left behind. Claire checked in quickly, tapping at her phone, correcting a young attendant about her mileage points. I stood a few steps behind, holding my purse against my chest, the way women of my generation were taught to do in public. When the attendant asked about seating preferences, Claire said, "She'll be fine anywhere near the aisle. Not my mother, not she needs oxygen access, just she." I smiled, out of habit more than anything. The attendant nodded politely and tagged my suitcase with a yellow label that read, "Special Assistance." I stared at the word special for a long time. It's a word that can mean anything, precious, burdensome, fragile, in the way. I had dressed carefully that morning. Navy slacks, a cream sweater, the pearl earrings I wore to Claire's college graduation decades ago. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in business class, or at least near it. But as we moved through security, she kept stepping ahead of me, her heels clicking a rhythm that didn't wait for my shuffle. When I needed to pause to catch my breath, she sighed quietly, pretending not to. At one point she turned and said, "Mom, you should have taken the wheelchair option. It's easier for everyone." Everyone. I knew what she meant. Easier for her, less visible for me. We stopped at a cafe near the gate. She ordered a cappuccino for herself and a small bottle of water for me. "You can't have caffeine," she reminded, though I hadn't asked for any. I wanted to tell her that I hadn't had a real coffee since her father's funeral, that I still missed the smell of it in the mornings, but I didn't. I just smiled again, and the smile felt like a chore. Around us, people laughed into phones, clinked cups, and scrolled through itineraries. The airport soundtrack, metal wheels on tile, boarding calls, the faint hum of air conditioning, felt like a chorus of departures. I sat there and watched my daughter study her reflection in the cafe window. She looked flawless and far away. When the boarding call came, she stood up first. "I'm Group 1, she said, almost apologetically. "You're Group 4, but you'll manage." Manage. The word landed heavy. She leaned down, kissed the air near my cheek, not quite touching it, and walked toward the priority line. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of being the footnote to her efficiency. Tired of the kind of love that gets rationed out like oxygen, controlled, measured, never abundant. Instead, I said nothing. I adjusted the strap of my purse and waited for my group to be called. When I finally boarded, the aisle was already crowded with people lifting suitcases into overhead bins. My hands aren't steady anymore, and the small tank clanked softly against the armrest as I passed. A young man in a hoodie helped me with my bag, wordlessly, with the kind of kindness that feels both pure and temporary. I thanked him. My seat was 36B, middle, near the bathrooms. The window seat was already taken by a woman who smelled of citrus perfume. She nodded politely, but didn't move her elbows. The aisle seat stayed empty until the last boarding call, when a large man with headphones settled in without a word. I fastened my belt, checked the flow on my oxygen, and tried to focus on breathing evenly. From where I sat, I could see the curtain separating us from business class, that small line of fabric that meant so much more than comfort. I imagined Claire on the other side, sipping something sparkling, unfolding her newspaper, not once thinking to turn around. I told myself it didn't matter, but it did. It mattered because the seat beside her was meant to be mine, not the literal seat, but the place beside her, the space where a mother should still be allowed to exist. I wasn't jealous of her success or her money. I was jealous of her certainty, the certainty that she no longer needed me except as an occasional errand of duty. As the plane taxied, I watched the runway blur into streaks of light. The engines roared, and I felt that old thrill for a second, the memory of flight before it became a metaphor for leaving. My hand rested on the armrest, knotted with veins and faint freckles. I thought of how those same hands once buttoned her school uniform, stitched her ballet ribbons, signed permission slips, and waved at departing buses. Now they gripped an oxygen tube, invisible work turned visible at last. The plane lifted, and with it, something in me ached, a long, slow pull toward memory. I remembered our first flight together, Claire at 7, clutching her teddy bear, her small hand in mine, as she asked if clouds were soft enough to sleep on. She used to believe everything I said. She used to look up at me like I was the sky itself. Somewhere between then and now, she learned that the sky was too low, too ordinary, and she climbed above it without me. I stared ahead at the glossy seatback screen and thought about how people disappear long before they die. They fade from conversations, from family photos, from the front seats of cars and planes. You start by giving up little things, your chair at dinner, your turn to speak, your right to choose the music, and one day you realize you've been reassigned to economy in every part of life. I didn't mind the smaller seat or the lack of champagne. I minded that she'd stopped seeing me as someone who once built the road she now walks on. Somewhere above the clouds, the cabin lights dimmed, and I felt the pressure shift in my ears. I closed my eyes and listened to the hiss of the oxygen, steady, faithful, the sound of persistence. Around me, strangers slept or stared at glowing screens. I thought of Claire again, just a few rows ahead but worlds away. Maybe she was watching a movie. Maybe she was sleeping under one of those soft gray blankets they hand out like grace. I wondered if she thought of me, if she imagined me comfortable, content, grateful. She always assumes gratitude, even when she offers condescension. I pressed my palm to my chest and felt the faint rhythm of my heart, still stubborn, still present. I told myself that the flight would be short, that all I had to do was make it to the landing. But beneath that calm reasoning, Another thought whispered, "You don't have to sit where you're told anymore." It came out of nowhere, quiet but undeniable, like turbulence that reminds you the air has moods of its own. That's when I opened my eyes and caught the reflection of my face in the darkened window. Tired, yes, but not defeated. There are moments, even at 81, when clarity strikes like lightning through an old tree, and you realize the roots are still alive. I sat up a little straighter, adjusted the mask, and thought, maybe this is the last flight I'll ever take with her, or maybe it's the first one I take for myself. The thought made me smile, a real one this time, small and private. Outside, the clouds parted to reveal a thin line of dawn. The light spread slowly, and I watched it without blinking, as if I might miss the proof that the world still renews itself, whether or not we are invited to sit in the front. I first realized it wasn't just indifference, but something deliberate when the flight attendant came to check my ticket. Her name tag read Marisol, and her voice carried that soft authority of someone who has seen everything human beings can do to one another inside a confined metal tube. She looked at the oxygen tank, at my trembling hands, and then at the boarding pass. Her brow furrowed slightly, the smallest frown, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. "Ma'am," she said gently, "you should have been seated closer to the front. It's standard for passengers with medical equipment." I told her it was fine, that my daughter had handled the arrangements. Marisol looked toward the curtained divide ahead of us, the border between what is paid for and what is deserved, and nodded slowly, as if understanding something that I was still too polite to say aloud. For a moment, I imagined standing up, walking through that narrow aisle, pulling back the curtain, and asking my daughter why she had done it. But of course, I didn't. Mothers of my generation don't cause scenes. We absorb them. We swallow hurt the way others swallow pills, habitually, without water, without complaint. The plane had reached its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft chime that sounded too cheerful for the mood I carried. I closed my eyes and tried to rest, but the air felt dry, thinner somehow, and I needed to adjust the flow of oxygen. My hands shook, and Marisol appeared again, helping without asking. Her touch was quick, professional, but I felt seen in a way that startled me. "Just breathe slowly," she said. "You're okay." The words, so simple, landed heavier than I expected, because no one close to me had said them in years. From where I sat, I could hear faint laughter drifting through the curtain. My daughter's voice pitched in that bright social tone she used when she wanted to sound charming. She was probably chatting with another executive, perhaps a man her age, someone who would find her confidence intoxicating. I tried not to imagine her sipping wine, crossing her legs elegantly, pretending that her mother wasn't a few rows behind, breathing through a plastic tube. Still, my mind insisted on the image, and it burned. I wanted to understand when exactly love had turned into performance, when care had turned into inconvenience. Maybe it had been gradual, like altitude changes you only feel once your ears start to ache. The meal service began, and the attendants pushed their carts down the aisles with practiced efficiency. When they reached my row, the man beside me lifted his headphones without removing them completely, pointing at the chicken option. The woman by the window requested the pasta and immediately put on her sleeping mask. When it was my turn, I asked for tea. "Decaf, please, if you have it." Marisol nodded and returned with a small cup and a biscuit wrapped in clear plastic. I placed it carefully on the tray and looked at it as if it were an offering. The tea smelled faintly of lemon, the kind of comfort that never asks questions. I sipped it slowly, but my mind wouldn't settle. There was a time when Claire wouldn't even let me lift my own suitcase, a time when she called twice a day to check if I was eating enough vegetables. Now she called once a week, always in a rush, her voice slicing through the receiver like a rehearsed line from a play she'd grown tired of performing. I don't know what changed first, her tone or my expectations, but somewhere in the middle, silence became easier for both of us. The flight stretched long and monotonous. Hours passed, measured only by the slow dimming of cabin lights and the occasional cough or snore. When the turbulence began, it came gently at first, a subtle shiver through the metal belly of the plane. People stirred, tightened seatbelts, closed laptops. I gripped the armrest, not out of fear of crashing, but out of fear that my oxygen tube might dislodge. Marisol appeared again, calm and efficient, her dark hair pinned back. "You're doing great," she said as she secured my tank's tubing. The man beside me glanced sideways, perhaps uncomfortable at the visible reminder of mortality so near his elbow. I almost apologized for existing, for breathing too loudly, but stopped myself. For once, I didn't want to make anyone else comfortable. Through the thin curtain, I could hear another round of laughter, glasses clinking, the murmur of comfort and privilege. The contrast was almost comic, the turbulence rattling our seats while the voices ahead floated steady and detached. It struck me then that this wasn't just a difference in ticket class. It was a map of my entire relationship with my daughter. She, in the insulated quiet of business class, where space and service softened every rough edge. I, in economy, where breathing required strategy and patience. I wasn't angry in that moment, not yet, just awake to the clarity of what it meant. The plane steadied after a few minutes. People relaxed, screens flickered back on, and the familiar hum of altitude returned. I took out the small photo I kept tucked in my wallet, Claire at 10 years old, her hair in uneven pigtails, holding a paper kite we had made together. I looked at that face, wide-eyed and sunburned, and felt the ache of something irretrievable. I remembered that day, the wind lifting the kite higher than we expected, her laughter spilling out like pure sunlight. "Don't let go," she'd shouted, and I had promised I wouldn't. But of course we all let go, in small ways, until we realize our hands are empty. A shadow fell across my tray table, and when I looked up, Marisol was there again. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "would you mind following me for a moment?" I blinked, startled. "Is something wrong?" She smiled gently. "Nothing at all. I just think you'd be more comfortable up front. We have an open seat." I hesitated, glancing at the curtain, the invisible wall of hierarchy. "Oh, that's not necessary," I murmured. "My daughter's up there, and I wouldn't want—" She interrupted softly. "You need room for your oxygen, and it's our policy to ensure your safety." She said policy, but I heard dignity. I followed her, dragging my small tank carefully through the narrow aisle. Eyes followed me, some curious, some kind, some merely irritated at the brief inconvenience. When Marisol pulled back the curtain, I saw the glow of softer lighting, wider seats, quieter breathing. My daughter was 2 rows ahead, leaning toward a man, laughing again. She didn't see me at first. Marisol gestured to an empty seat on the opposite side, a window seat with a folded blanket. "Here we are," she said. I thanked her and sat down, the seat gently cradling my tired body in a way that felt almost merciful. For a few minutes, I simply breathed. The hum of the engine softened. The air seemed warmer, the light dimmer. It was astonishing how small a shift of space could feel like deliverance. Then I saw Claire turn slightly, her expression freezing mid-laugh as her eyes met mine. It was a flicker, shock, then annoyance, then something unreadable. She leaned closer to her companion and whispered something. He glanced back briefly, then looked away, uninterested. I offered a small smile, not out of triumph, but out of peace. She turned forward again, her shoulders stiff. Marisol brought me a cup of warm water and a real glass, not plastic, and a small plate of fruit. "Complimentary," she said. I thanked her, my voice steadier than it had been all day. As I ate slowly, I realized that no grand confrontation was needed. The truth had already unfolded in silence. The upgrade wasn't about comfort, it was about visibility. Someone had noticed what my daughter had chosen not to see. That awareness, quiet, undeniable, was the catalyst I didn't know I'd been waiting for. When the lights dimmed again, I looked out the window. The horizon was a soft blend of gold and indigo, the kind of beauty people miss while trying to get somewhere faster. I thought of the word fine, how she had said I'd be fine in economy. Fine is what people say when they mean invisible. But here, breathing evenly, cushioned by kindness that cost me nothing, I realized I was more than fine. I was awake. I was still here. I closed my eyes, letting the hum of altitude carry me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a passenger in my own life. After the landing, the world felt both too bright and too small. The fluorescent lights of the arrival terminal were merciless, washing every face into the same pallid color of exhaustion. I moved slowly, the oxygen tank rattling softly at my side, trying not to lose sight of my daughter as she walked briskly ahead, her carry-on gliding behind her like a shadow that had been trained to obey. She didn't look back, not even once, not when I paused to steady my balance or when the strap of my purse tangled with the tubing at my wrist. I told myself she was simply distracted, that she was thinking about ground transportation or the emails that would already be waiting on her phone, but the truth pressed harder with every step. She was used to walking alone, or worse, she was used to walking without me. At baggage claim, the carousel turned with its mechanical groan, suitcases spilling out in rhythmic intervals. I stood behind the yellow line, clutching the handle of my tank as if it were a tether keeping me from floating into irrelevance. Claire was several feet away, scrolling on her phone, smiling slightly at something on the screen. She had that professional smile, the one that looked warm from a distance, but disappeared the moment you looked closer. When she finally caught my eye, she raised a single finger, the international gesture for wait. I nodded, though I hadn't been planning to move. She collected her sleek black suitcase, then gestured for me to follow. Outside, the air was thick and humid, the kind of heat that makes fabric stick to skin. The taxi line stretched endlessly, people sweating under the canopy, murmuring complaints about delays and lost luggage. Claire looked around impatiently, her free hand pressed against her hip. "We'll take the hotel shuttle," she said without turning to me. "It's faster." I didn't argue. I rarely do. We waited in silence until the shuttle arrived, its doors sighing open like a weary lung. The driver helped me lift the oxygen tank aboard, his kindness wordless, practiced. I thanked him softly and took a seat near the back while Claire sat several rows ahead, already opening her laptop. For the entire 30-minute ride, she typed furiously, the glow from her screen illuminating the line of her jaw. I watched the city blur by through the window, its billboards and cranes, its restless pulse. I wondered if she even saw it. When we reached the hotel, she checked in quickly, efficient as always. "We'll share a room," she said, though her tone made it sound like a concession rather than a gesture of care. The suite was modern, sterile, too cold from the overzealous air conditioning. 2 beds, a desk, a wall of windows overlooking nothing in particular. I placed my tank beside the nightstand and sat carefully on the edge of the mattress. Claire was already unpacking, hanging her clothes in the closet with the brisk precision of someone accustomed to being observed. I watched her line up her toiletries on the counter, serums, compacts, bottles that cost more than the flights themselves. It was all so familiar, so entirely hers, and yet I felt like a stranger invited to an exhibit of my own child. She finally spoke without looking at me. "You should rest, Mom. You look tired." I nodded. It was a long flight. "Yes," she said, still busy, "and they were kind enough to move you up front. That was lucky." There was something sharp under the word lucky, something that scraped at the edges of civility. I could have told her it wasn't luck, that it was mercy, but mercy is something she's never known how to recognize, so I simply said, "Yes, very lucky." She paused then, finally meeting my eyes in the mirror. "You didn't ask for that, did you?" The question was light but loaded. "No," I said. "The attendant just noticed the oxygen." She gave a small laugh that didn't reach her eyes. They notice everything these days. And just like that, the conversation ended, suspended in the same quiet we always retreated into when truth became too heavy to carry together. That night, while she showered, I stood by the window, watching the city lights pulse below. Cars streamed through intersections, red and white ribbons weaving endlessly into distance. I thought of the flight again, the curtain, the look she gave me when she saw where I was sitting, the way she turned back to her companion as if nothing had shifted. For her, perhaps nothing had. For me, everything had. There was no single act of cruelty, nothing she could be accused of outright, only the 1,000 small gestures that accumulate over years until they build a wall you can't see over anymore. She hadn't abandoned me. She had simply erased me, slowly, politely, efficiently. When she emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a white robe, steam still curling around her hair, she looked younger than she had in years. The glow of vanity lights softened her, made her almost beautiful again, the way she looked on the mornings of her ballet recitals when I used to fix her bun and tell her she was the most graceful thing I'd ever seen. "You're thinking about something," she said, drying her hair. I smiled faintly. "Just remembering." "You shouldn't dwell," she said. "It makes you sad." "Sometimes sadness is the only thing that feels honest," I replied, more to the window than to her. She didn't respond, but I saw her shoulders tense in the reflection. We went to sleep without another word. I lay awake long after she began breathing softly beside me, the rhythmic exhale of someone untouched by conscience. The air conditioner hummed steadily, filling the silence with its artificial wind. I thought about what it meant to be fine, that word she used so easily, and I decided it was the cruelest word in our language. It asks you to survive without joy, to endure without complaint, to exist without witness. I had been fine my whole life, and look where it brought me, sitting in a hotel room beside my daughter, 2 strangers bound by duty and habit. The next morning, I woke early. The light through the curtains was thin and gray. Claire was already dressed, her hair pinned neatly, her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, the conference starts at 9, she said briskly. "No, I can't bring guests." She glanced at me, her hand partially covering the receiver. "I ordered breakfast for you. It'll come up soon." Then she returned to her call, her voice dropping into that business cadence that shuts out intimacy. I nodded, though she wasn't looking. When she left, the door clicked softly behind her, and the quiet that followed was the kind of quiet that expands, filling every corner with the echo of absence. Room service arrived, a tray with oatmeal, toast, and coffee I wasn't supposed to drink. I sat by the window and ate slowly, savoring the solitude. For the first time in years, I realized that silence could feel like freedom. The city below was already alive, horns blaring, people hurrying to be important. I watched them and felt a strange stillness settle over me, the kind that precedes a decision you haven't yet admitted to yourself. By afternoon, Claire returned, flushed and triumphant, talking about panels and investors and opportunities. I listened, nodding in the right places, inserting small sounds of approval that kept the rhythm of her monologue intact. She thrived on admiration. It was the air she breathed. When she finally paused to sip water, I said quietly, "You know, I've been thinking. Maybe tomorrow I'll explore the city a bit. There's an art museum nearby." She looked startled. "By yourself?" "Yes," I said. "I still remember how to walk." She hesitated, then forced a smile. "Of course, just don't overdo it." That night, I packed my purse with a map, some cash, and my identification. I didn't tell her where I was going, not really. I said the museum, but what I meant was anywhere else. When dawn came, I slipped out quietly, leaving a note on the desk. "Gone out for a walk. Don't wait for me." The lobby was cool, the smell of coffee and perfume mingling in the air. I took a taxi to the airport without thinking, the driver chatting about weather and construction detours. I answered politely, but my mind was already boarding. At the terminal, I looked up at the departure board, rows of destinations glowing in yellow letters. For the first time, none of them looked impossible. I thought of how small a life can become when you let others dictate its boundaries. I didn't want to disappear from her world in bitterness. I wanted to reappear in my own. The realization wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, like a door clicking shut from the inside. When Claire returned to the hotel later that morning, she would find the empty bed, the oxygen tank gone, and maybe she would feel a flicker of worry before reason soothed it away. She would tell herself I was fine, because that's what she always tells herself, and she would be right in a way she couldn't yet understand. Because for the first time in decades, I truly was. The taxi that morning smelled faintly of mint gum and gasoline, a strangely comforting combination that reminded me of my late husband's car on the few summer days when he used to drive with the windows open, humming tunelessly under his breath. I sat in the back seat, watching the city slide past, half expecting at any moment to feel regret pressing down on me, but it never came. There was no panic, no trembling hands, no sudden need to turn back to the hotel. The absence of fear felt almost suspicious, like a room gone too quiet after years of noise. When the driver asked where I was heading, I looked at the electronic map on his dashboard and said the first thing that came to me, "To the central station, please." My voice sounded calm, practiced, almost detached, but inside I felt something move, some deep pulse of life that had been sleeping for too long. The station was enormous and bewildering. Announcements echoed from high ceilings, overlapping in a dozen accents and rhythms. People were dragging suitcases, clutching coffee cups, embracing, hurrying. The sheer abundance of motion was dizzying and somehow cleansing. I stood still in the middle of it all, the oxygen tank at my side like a stubborn companion, and realized how strange it was to be completely unaccounted for. No one knew where I was, and for the first time in years, that fact didn't feel dangerous. It felt liberating. I bought a ticket without overthinking, a one-way seat on the early afternoon train heading north toward a coastal town whose name I barely recognized. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere that didn't know me as anyone's mother. On the train, the rhythm of the wheels lulled me into a half-dream. The land outside shifted from glass towers to fields and low hills, from the smell of diesel to salt air. The movement soothed the ache in my knees, and for a while I forgot about age. A young woman sat across from me reading a thick novel, her face half hidden behind the pages. At one point, she looked up and smiled, and for a brief instant, I saw my daughter's face from 30 years ago, unguarded, bright with curiosity. It vanished quickly, replaced by the polite indifference of a stranger. Still, that ghost of recognition stayed with me, and I let it. There are memories that no longer hurt. They simply remind you that you once belonged somewhere. By the time the train arrived at the coastal town, the air had shifted. It was cooler, damp with the promise of rain. I stepped onto the platform and inhaled deeply, feeling the sting of salt in my lungs. I walked slowly through the small terminal until I found a bench and sat down, the wheels of my tank squeaking softly against the tiles. Across the street, a row of low buildings leaned toward the sea, their paint faded from years of wind. I spotted a modest inn with a wooden sign that read, "The Lantern Guest House." The name felt like an invitation. Inside, the lobby was simple and warm, the kind of place that smelled of coffee and rain-soaked coats. The woman at the front desk looked up with a practiced smile that wasn't insincere. She asked how long I'd be staying, and I said, "I'm not sure yet," which was the most honest answer I had given anyone in a long time. My room overlooked the harbor. The window panes rattled faintly whenever the wind shifted, and the curtains moved like slow breaths. I unpacked my few things, a change of clothes, a photo of my husband, the small wallet with emergency cash, and placed them on the dresser. The silence felt strange, but not empty. It had a weight to it, a kind of waiting quality, as if the walls themselves had grown used to holding other people's beginnings. I lay on the bed, the thin quilt cool against my skin, and thought about how every story I had ever told about myself had always started with someone else's name: wife, mother, grandmother, helper, caretaker. It was time to begin one that started with my own. That evening I walked to the pier, my steps uneven but determined. The sunset was shy, hiding behind low clouds, but its colors lingered in the water, shifting between pink and gray. Fishermen were packing up their nets, seagulls crying overhead. I sat on a bench near the edge and watched them, remembering the summers when Claire was small and we would visit the beach, how she used to collect shells with obsessive focus, how she once tried to build a castle that could survive the tide. I wanted to believe that child was still somewhere inside her, the one who laughed without calculation and loved without fear of appearing foolish. Maybe she was. Maybe she had just forgotten the language of tenderness. A light rain began to fall, soft enough that I didn't move. The sensation of droplets on my face was almost sacred. I thought of how long it had been since I'd allowed myself to get rained on without rushing for shelter. The wind carried the smell of seaweed and engine oil, the texture of reality unfiltered by comfort. I could feel every breath of it, every small sting against my cheeks, and I let it rewrite something inside me. The oxygen tube hissed softly, keeping rhythm with the sea. I whispered to no one in particular, "I'm still here." It wasn't defiance, it was gratitude. Over the next few days, I began to form a routine that felt shockingly my own. Mornings were for long walks along the damp boardwalk, the sound of gulls replacing the alarms and notifications that used to punctuate Claire's mornings. I discovered a cafe near the harbor that served real tea in porcelain cups and didn't rush you out the door. The owner, an older woman named Martha, always wore mismatched earrings and spoke with the kind of warmth that didn't require conversation. She never asked why I was there, never assumed a story, just refilled my cup and smiled when I thanked her. There is a rare mercy in being treated as ordinary. One morning, she placed a newspaper on my table. "Tourists like to know what's happening," she said. I opened it absent-mindedly, scanning headlines about the weather and local council meetings. Then my eyes caught a smaller article buried near the bottom. "Missing woman last seen at downtown hotel. Family concerned." There was no photo, just a description that might have been anyone, but I knew. It mentioned my age, the oxygen tank, the name of the hotel. I stared at it for a long time, feeling neither fear nor guilt, only an odd sense of distance, as if I were reading about a stranger who shared my history, but not my life. When Martha noticed the change in my expression, she asked gently, "You all right?" I folded the paper and nodded. "Yes," I said, "better than I've been in years." That afternoon, I walked into a small thrift store tucked between two shuttered shops. The shelves were crowded with forgotten objects, teacups, picture frames, chipped vases, faded postcards. I wandered without purpose until I saw it. A worn navy coat, heavy wool, its lining frayed but intact. I tried it on. It fit as though it remembered me. The clerk, a quiet young man with ink on his fingers, said, "That one's been here forever. No one ever wants it." I smiled. "Then it's been waiting for me." I paid in cash and walked out wearing it despite the mild weather. The weight of the fabric settled on my shoulders like approval. Back in my room, I hung the coat carefully by the window. Outside, the tide was low, exposing dark rocks slick with seaweed. I thought of Claire again, not with bitterness, but with a strange, tender resignation. She would be furious, perhaps humiliated, spinning explanations for colleagues and neighbors. But maybe, deep down, she would also feel relief, the kind that comes when something inevitable finally happens. We had both been pretending for too long, pretending that we still recognized each other, pretending that the rituals of care were enough to disguise the absence of affection. That night, I wrote in the small notepad I'd found on the desk. The pen scratched unevenly on the paper, my handwriting looping awkwardly after years of disuse. "I am not lost. I am only somewhere new." The words looked fragile, but they were true. I slept better that night than I had in months. The sound of rain against the glass became a lullaby, and the steady rhythm of my own breathing was the only reassurance I needed. The next morning, I awoke to light streaming through the curtains, brighter than before. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel the weight of obligation pulling me out of bed. I made tea, wrapped myself in the navy coat, and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet wood and promise. Somewhere behind me, the world I had left was spinning in confusion, people asking questions, making phone calls, creating stories to fill the space I'd vacated. But none of that reached me here. I walked toward the sea, feeling the wind against my face, and understood with absolute certainty that this was the midpoint of my life, not in years, but in meaning. Everything before had been endurance. Everything after would be choice. The rain returned with a quiet persistence, a kind of patient insistence that blurred the horizon and turned the harbor into a smear of silver. Days passed like that, gray and wet, the kind of days that seemed designed for introspection, when even the seagulls sound subdued. I had grown comfortable with solitude, perhaps too comfortable. My world had narrowed to the rhythm of waves against the rocks, to the small rituals that gave each day a sense of shape. The morning walk to the cafe, the hour I spent reading the local paper, the evening cup of tea that marked the boundary between daylight and silence. The staff at the Lantern had stopped asking how long I would stay. I paid my rent each week in cash, and the woman at the desk accepted it without question. She had the good sense to understand that sometimes people arrive not to visit, but to vanish. One morning, as I sat by the window in the cafe, watching rain chase itself down the glass, Martha, the owner, placed an envelope beside my teacup. "This came for you," she said. I frowned. "For me? How?" She shrugged. "Postmarked from the city. The address just said, Lantern Guest House, Harbor View Room. You've made an impression, it seems." I stared at the handwriting, rounded, careful, the kind that belongs to someone young. When I opened it, a few sheets of lined paper slid out, slightly smudged at the edges. The first words made my heart stumble. "Grandma, where are you?" It was from my grandson, Daniel's boy, though in my heart he would always be the child who once called me Nana Bird, because I used to whistle to him through the kitchen window. He was in his 20s now, the only one who still sent me birthday cards, even when his parents forgot. His letter was simple, direct, and heartbreakingly gentle. "Dad says you left without telling anyone. Mom is furious, but I don't believe you'd just disappear. I keep checking the news, and I saw a small article about a missing elderly woman with an oxygen tank. I knew it had to be you. Are you safe? Please let me know you're all right. I miss you. I don't care where you are. I just want to hear your voice." I read the letter twice, then a third time, tracing the faint indentations of his pen as though they might reveal something more than the words themselves. There was no guilt in his tone, no judgment, only concern that felt clean and unspoiled by the family's usual undercurrent of performance. For the first time since I'd arrived, the air in my small room felt heavy. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the drawer beside my bed. I told myself I would write back, that I would at least send a note to ease his worry. But I didn't, not yet. The wound of kindness takes longer to heal than the wound of cruelty. The next few days were uneasy. I found myself glancing over my shoulder when I walked through town, half expecting to see a familiar figure in a sharp coat, scanning faces with a mix of irritation and desperation. Each time a car slowed near the cafe, I stiffened. The illusion of invisibility had been perfect, and now it was broken. The letter had tethered me back to a world I had worked so hard to untie myself from. I began to think of Claire, not with anger, but with a kind of detached curiosity, as though she were a character in someone else's story. What would she do when she learned I was alive, living quietly by the sea, not lost, but liberated? I suspected the truth would offend her more than grief ever could. The storm worsened that weekend, the kind of storm that makes windows moan and floors vibrate. The power flickered twice and then went out completely, plunging the inn into darkness. The guests gathered in the small lounge downstairs, clutching candles and mugs of lukewarm coffee. Someone produced a deck of cards. Someone else began telling ghost stories. I sat in an armchair near the fireplace, the oxygen tank humming softly at my feet. The air smelled of wax and damp wood. There was something ancient about the scene, like a tableau from a time before electricity or loneliness. I was content just to listen to the voices around me. For the first time in years, I was surrounded by people without feeling invisible. When the lights finally returned hours later, I went back to my room to find another envelope slipped under my door. My pulse jumped. This one was smaller, more deliberate. Inside was a single sheet of hotel stationery. Mom, if you get this, please call me. I'm in town. Claire. The name hit me like a sudden gust of cold air. So she had found me. Or maybe she had been looking longer than I realized. I sat down on the bed, letter in hand, and tried to picture her arrival, the practiced composure, the tight smile, the faint note of martyrdom in her voice. I imagined her rehearsing her lines, the way she always did before confrontations. I knew how the conversation would go, concern disguised as control, regret rephrased as accusation. I folded the letter neatly and placed it beside my grandson's. Then I drew the curtains and turned off the lamp. For the first time since childhood, I hid in plain sight, breathing quietly until sleep claimed me. The next morning, I went down to breakfast later than usual. Martha gave me a cautious look. "There was a woman here last night asking after you," she said. "Tall, elegant, the kind of coat you don't wear in this town. Said she was your daughter." I nodded slowly. "Did you tell her anything?" "Just that you were resting. She left a number." She slid a small card across the counter. I glanced at it but didn't pick it up. "If she comes again," I said softly, "tell her I've gone out walking." For the rest of the day, I avoided the main streets. I walked along the shoreline instead, the waves dragging long white scars across the sand. The wind was cold, but it steadied me. I thought about turning back, about facing her, about saying all the things I'd rehearsed in my head for years, but never had the courage to voice. But I knew how that would end, with explanations that dissolved into tears, with apologies that would only lead to new conditions. Some people mistake reconciliation for surrender. I couldn't give her that satisfaction. 2 days passed before I saw her. It was late afternoon, the cafe nearly empty. I was reading the newspaper when the doorbell chimed and she walked in, rain glistening on her hair. For a moment she didn't see me. She spoke to Martha at the counter, her voice calm, polite. Then she turned and our eyes met. She froze, as if uncertain whether to approach or flee. I closed the newspaper slowly and gestured to the seat across from me. "Sit," I said. She obeyed, the way she always did when things became too quiet to manipulate. Up close, she looked tired, her beauty sharpened by worry. "You look well," she said, as if surprised by it. "I am well," I replied. We sat in silence for a moment. She clasped her hands together on the table. "Why did you leave?" she asked finally. "Because I needed to," I said. "You could have told me." I smiled faintly. "I did, many times. You just didn't listen." Her jaw tightened. "Do you have any idea what you put us through? The police, the searches, people thought you were dead." "And what did you think?" "I thought you were being dramatic," she said, then winced as if hearing herself. Martha, sensing the tension, brought over 2 cups of tea without a word and retreated behind the counter. Claire stared at the steam rising from hers. "I came to take you home," she said eventually. "I don't need a home. I have one." "This isn't real, Mom. You can't live like this, alone, in a tiny room, with that machine." I touched the side of the tank gently. "This machine helps me breathe. It's more honest than most people I've known." She sighed, exasperated. "You're being cruel." "No," I said, "just clear." She looked away, blinking fast. "Kieran, he's been worried sick." "I read his letter," I said. "He's a good boy." "He's a man now," she corrected. "He deserves answers." "So do I said softly, "but I stopped expecting them from you a long time ago." The words landed between us like stones dropped into deep water. She stood abruptly, reaching for her purse. "You can't stay here forever," she said. "No one can." I smiled. Then we'll have that in common." She hesitated, her eyes softening for just a second. "Please call me when you're ready to be reasonable." I almost laughed at the familiarity of that word, reasonable. The tone she used when I was too emotional, too honest, too much like a person instead of an accessory. "Goodbye, Claire," I said. She opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. She left without another word, her heels clicking against the floor in a rhythm I recognized as retreat. When the door closed behind her, I exhaled slowly. Martha appeared with a cloth, pretending to wipe the table. "Family?" she asked. "Something like that," I said. She nodded, then placed a small slice of cake in front of me. "On the house," she said. "Looks like you've earned it." That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain beat harder against the window, and the sound of the sea seemed closer than usual, as if it were creeping up to the doorstep. I sat by the window in my navy coat, the letter from my grandson in my lap. The ink had faded slightly, the creases softening. I thought about calling him, about hearing his voice just once. Instead, I took out a blank sheet of paper and began to write. "Dear Kieran, I'm safe. Don't worry about me. I'm where I need to be. Maybe one day I'll tell you everything, but for now, it's enough to know that I finally learned how to breathe for myself. Love, Grandma." I folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and wrote his name carefully across the front. I didn't have his address, but I would find a way. It wasn't a promise. It was a beginning. When I finally turned off the light, I felt something inside me loosen, a small knot, years old, unraveling quietly in the dark. The next morning, the sky was pale and tentative, the storm finally breaking. I walked to the post office and mailed the letter without ceremony. The clerk didn't ask for a return address, and I didn't offer one. Outside, the air smelled of sea and electricity, the scent that follows both endings and beginnings. For the first time since the airport, I felt light. Not happy exactly, but unburdened. I had faced the past, spoken the unspeakable, and remained standing. As I walked back to the lantern, the clouds began to thin, and sunlight spilled across the wet pavement, turning puddles into mirrors. I caught my reflection in one of them, older, smaller, but unmistakably alive. The woman who had boarded that plane weeks ago would not have recognized me, and perhaps that was the point. I smiled, a quiet, private smile that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with survival. The future, for once, looked wide open, and I intended to meet it without asking anyone's permission. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way most final reckonings do, not in the thunderclap of confrontation, but in the subtle reordering of breath and thought. The morning after I mailed Kieran's letter, I woke to an unusual stillness. The air was heavy but not hostile, the kind of weight that precedes change rather than disaster. The sea outside my window was calm, glass-like, a muted reflection of the clouds above. I had intended to go for my walk, to follow the same path along the boardwalk, but when I stood, my knees trembled, and a wave of dizziness blurred the room for a moment. I sat back down and waited for the world to steady itself. It did, eventually, though the moment left behind a faint echo of fragility that felt new. For the first time since arriving, I sensed the boundary of my own endurance, the edge between independence and vulnerability. I spent the morning in the cafe, reading the paper, watching the steady rhythm of locals passing by. When I returned to the inn, there was a message waiting for me at the front desk, scrawled hastily on a piece of paper. "Your daughter stopped by again. Said she'll return tonight." The handwriting belonged to the night clerk, a young woman who always spoke in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the furniture. I thanked her and took the note upstairs. The knowledge that Claire was coming back filled me not with dread this time, but with an eerie calm. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to plead. Whatever was to happen tonight would be final, not in anger, but in acceptance. I spent the afternoon tidying my small room, folding my clothes, aligning the few books I had collected in a neat row along the windowsill. It was absurd, perhaps, to prepare as though for an inspection, but I wanted the space to reflect the quiet order I had built here, the fragile dignity of a life reclaimed. Dusk came early, the horizon melting into a dull gray. I put on my navy coat and sat by the window, watching the street lamps flicker on one by one. When the knock came, it was soft but certain. I didn't move right away. For a brief second, I imagined ignoring it, letting her stand there in the hallway, rehearsing her patience until it curdled into anger. But I knew I couldn't. I rose slowly, adjusted the oxygen flow, and opened the door. She stood there, framed by the dim corridor light, her hair damp from drizzle, her face taut with exhaustion. There were dark circles under her eyes, and for the first time in years, she looked smaller than me. "May I come in?" she asked. Her voice was even, but the edges were frayed. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the chair by the window. She sat without removing her coat, hands clasped in her lap. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the oxygen and the occasional groan of wind against the glass. Finally, she said, "You're really living here." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said, "for now." She nodded, glancing around the room, her eyes catching on the photograph of her father on the dresser. "I brought you something." From her bag, she pulled out a small box and set it on the table between us. Inside was a new portable oxygen concentrator, sleek and modern, much smaller than the one beside my bed. "It's lighter," she said, "easier to travel with." I looked at it for a long moment before answering. "Thank you," I said. "It's very kind." "It's not kindness," she replied. "It's necessary." Her tone was gentle but firm, the voice of someone still trying to maintain control. "I don't want you dragging that thing around anymore. It's dangerous." I smiled faintly. "I've managed so far." "Yes," she said, "by disappearing." I sighed and turned toward the window. The reflection of our two faces in the glass looked like a ghost of the past, overlapping but never merging. "You think I ran away," I said quietly, but I didn't. I just stopped following. She stared at me, her eyes sharp with something between confusion and hurt. "You make it sound like I've been leading you somewhere against your will." I shook my head. "Not against my will, against my nature. You've always needed everything to be perfect, efficient, unmessy, even your love." Her lips parted as if to protest, but I continued, my voice steady. "When your father died, I tried to be what you needed, calm, strong, composed. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person and became a duty. You loved me, yes, but only in the way people love the things they assume will always be there." She looked down, her fingers tightening. "That's not fair," she whispered. "I've done everything I could." "I know," I said, "and that's exactly the problem. You do. You manage, you fix, you organize, but you don't feel, not really. When I looked at you at the airport, when you told me I'd be fine in economy, I realized it wasn't cruelty. It was blindness. You didn't see me at all." Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away angrily. "You're making me sound like a monster." "No," I said softly. "Just human, just like me. We both built our lives around being strong for others, and now we don't know how to be gentle with each other." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Then she stood abruptly, pacing toward the window. "You can't stay here forever," she said again, her voice trembling now. "You'll get sick, and no one will be here to help you." "Then I'll get sick," I said simply, "and someone will help me, or they won't. But it will be because I asked, not because I was managed." She turned toward me, her face crumpling for the first time in years. "Do you hate me?" she asked, and the question was so small, so unguarded, that it struck something deep inside me. "No," I said. "I just stopped waiting for you to love me the way I loved you." Her shoulders sagged. "That's the saddest thing you've ever said." "It's also the truest," I replied. The storm broke then, sudden and violent, rain slashing against the window. Claire moved closer to the glass, watching the downpour as if it might wash away the conversation. "You've always been stubborn," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "You used to say it was our family's curse." I smiled. "A curse is just a strength misnamed." She laughed softly, a broken sound. "You sound like Dad." "Good," I said. He was the last person who knew how to listen. She turned then, and for a moment I saw the child she had been, the one who used to curl up against me during thunderstorms, who once cried when her kite tore in the wind. Without thinking, I opened my arms slightly. She hesitated, then crossed the room and let me hold her. Her body shook with the effort of keeping composure, and I felt the weight of all our unspoken years pressing between us. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was contact. When she finally pulled away, her face was streaked with tears she didn't bother to hide. "I don't know how to fix this," she said. "You don't have to," I told her. "It's not broken. It's just different now." She nodded slowly, wiping her cheeks. "Will you at least let me know you're alive?" "Yes," I said, "but not because you need to manage me, because I want to share my life with you, if you can accept it as it is." The tension eased then, not in a dramatic release, but in a quiet unwinding, like a tightly wound clock slowing to its natural rhythm. She sat again, and we talked, not about the past or the future, but about small, ordinary things, the sea, the cafe, the people in the town. I told her about Martha, about the coat, about the sense of peace that had surprised me here. She listened, really listened, and I saw something flicker in her expression, a recognition, perhaps, that I had built something beyond her reach, and that it was good. When she finally stood to leave, the storm had subsided into a soft drizzle. She paused at the door, looking back at me. "I'll call you in a few days," she said. "No promises," I replied with a smile. She laughed faintly, shaking her head. "You really are impossible." "So are you," I said. "That's how I know you're mine." After she left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching her figure disappear into the mist. There was no triumph, no relief, just a profound stillness. The air smelled of rain and salt, and something faintly metallic from the sea. I looked down at the new oxygen concentrator on the table and decided to keep it, not because she was right, but because it was practical. The gesture was enough. It meant we could both change, even a little. That night, I wrote one last entry in my notebook. She found me, and I let her, not because I was ready to return, but because she needed to see that leaving can also be love. I am not gone. I am becoming. I closed the notebook and turned off the light. The room was dark except for the faint glow from the harbor, a thin ribbon of light that curved across the floor. I lay back, listening to the rhythm of the waves, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace, not as an absence of pain, but as its transformation into something quiet, almost holy. The days that followed were gentle, the kind that slip by unnoticed until you realize they have stitched themselves into memory. The storm had scoured the air clean, and the sea, which had been dark and churning for weeks, now lay stretched out like silk, pale blue and forgiving. I woke each morning to the sound of gulls arguing outside the window, their cries echoing against the docks, and for the first time in years, I didn't hurry to fill the day with tasks or obligations. Time, I realized, no longer needed to be managed. It only needed to be lived. I moved slowly, deliberately, savoring the quiet rhythm of existence, tea steeping, pages turning, the steady whisper of oxygen. The simplicity of it was its own kind of wealth, one that required no audience and asked for nothing in return. Claire called, as she had promised, though not quite in the way I expected. The phone rang one afternoon while I was mending the loose hem of my coat. Her voice on the other end was careful, measured, as if she were afraid that any sudden movement in tone might shatter the fragile truce between us. She asked how I was feeling, whether the new machine was working properly, whether the sea air was too damp for my lungs. I answered honestly, but lightly, keeping the conversation balanced on the edge of warmth without slipping into the old pattern of apology and justification. We spoke like acquaintances who were learning to become family again, one cautious syllable at a time. Before hanging up, she said, almost shyly, "You sound different." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "I am different," I said, "and that's all right." In the following weeks, letters began to arrive, not from her, but from Kieran. They were full of small, tender details about his life. A new job, a stray cat he'd adopted, the garden he was trying to grow on his apartment balcony. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't scold. He simply shared, as if we had never fallen out of orbit. His handwriting was steady, firm, unashamedly human. I answered each letter in kind, telling him about the town, the sea, and the people who had unknowingly become the soft background of my new life. He called me my invisible grandmother, and I called him my anchor. There was something beautiful about our correspondence, 2 generations speaking across silence, not to bridge it, but to honor it. The locals had grown used to me by then. Martha always saved me the corner table by the window, and when she saw me coming down the street, she would already have the teapot waiting. Once she asked if I planned to stay through the winter, and I said yes, though I knew nothing was permanent, not even peace. She smiled knowingly. "The sea changes its mind every day," she said. "That's how you know it's alive." I thought about that long after she'd gone back behind the counter. Perhaps that was what I had done, changed my mind about what it meant to live. One morning, as autumn began to tint the edges of the town, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a photograph in a silver frame, Claire and Kieran together, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize, both smiling awkwardly, as if they hadn't yet learned how to smile for each other. There was a note attached in my daughter's handwriting, "For your window, so we're not all ghosts to each other." I set it on the table beside my bed, where the morning light would catch it, and I sat looking at it for a long time. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was a gesture of recognition, and that was more valuable. I began taking longer walks, sometimes as far as the cliffs beyond the harbor. From there, I could see the sea stretching endlessly, its surface changing color with every passing cloud. I found that I liked walking without destination, without the burden of arrival. The world, stripped of purpose, revealed its quiet generosity. I started talking to strangers, small conversations that left soft imprints, a fisherman who complained about the new tides, a child who offered me a pebble shaped like a heart, a woman who sang to herself as she painted the railings of her porch. In their company, I found a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with ownership or obligation. Occasionally, I caught myself thinking about the airport, the day it all began, or perhaps the day it ended. The sound of her voice saying, "You'll be fine in economy, Mom," had once carried the weight of rejection. Now it felt like a line from a story I'd already survived. I understood now that she hadn't meant cruelty. She had spoken from fear, the kind that grows when people mistake care for control. It had taken me most of a lifetime to learn that love isn't measured by sacrifice, but by the space it allows for another's breathing. As the season deepened, I noticed that the nights came earlier and the stars grew sharper, more insistent. I would sit by the window, wrapped in my navy coat, listening to the waves slide in and out like long, deliberate breaths. The world outside kept moving, ferries docking, fishermen shouting, teenagers laughing on the pier. But inside my room, there was only stillness. I began to write again, not letters this time, but small fragments, memories, reflections, moments of clarity. I wrote them without expectation, knowing that they were not for anyone else. It was enough to leave traces of thought, small footprints across paper, proof that I had existed as more than someone's mother or widow or patient. One evening, near the end of October, I took a walk to the lighthouse that stood at the far end of the breakwater. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with violet and gold. When I reached the end of the path, I sat on the low stone wall and looked out at the horizon. The wind tugged gently at my hair, carrying the faint scent of salt and pine. I thought of my husband, of Claire, of the child she used to be, and the woman she was still becoming. I thought of Kieran, whose kindness had arrived like sunlight through a fog. I thought of all the women I had known, neighbors, friends, strangers, who had learned too late that silence was not virtue. And I wished for them what I finally had, not freedom in the loud, defiant sense, but the quiet permission to exist unobserved, unjudged, unneeded. When I finally rose to leave, the lighthouse light began to turn, sweeping across the water in slow arcs. Each rotation cast a brief shimmer across the surface of the sea, a reminder that even in darkness, something watches, something guides. I walked back slowly, the oxygen machine humming softly beside me, its rhythm matching my steps. The town lights grew closer, warmer, like small promises waiting to be kept. Back in my room, I made tea and opened my notebook one last time. The pages were filled now, uneven and cluttered, but alive. I wrote a few final lines. If anyone finds this, know that I was not lost. I simply went where the air was clear enough to breathe. We spend our lives thinking love means staying, but sometimes it means leaving gently enough for someone to follow if they wish. I closed the notebook and set it beside the photograph of my daughter and grandson. That night, as I lay in bed, the moon rose over the harbor, pale and full. Its light slid across the floor, touching the edge of my coat, the frame, the small machine that kept me tethered to this world. I closed my eyes and listened to the soft, steady hiss of oxygen, life continuing, simple and unadorned. I felt no regret, no unfinished plea, only a deep, quiet gratitude for the strange, unplanned journey that had led me here. And in that stillness, before sleep came, I thought of every woman who had ever been told she would be fine in economy, every mother who had sat quietly while the world moved her backward. I wished them what I had found at last, That moment when you stop asking for the better seat and realize the sky belongs to you all the same.